gospel lesson this morning is Luke 22, verses 39 through 53. Hear now the word of the Lord. He came out and went, as was his custom, to the Mount of Olives, and the disciples followed him. When he reached the place, he said to them, "Pray that you may not come into the time of trial." Then he withdrew from them about a stone's throw, knelt down, and prayed, "Father, if you are willing, remove this cup from me. Yet not my will, but yours be done." Then an angel from heaven appeared to him and gave him strength. In his anguish he prayed more earnestly, and his sweat became like great drops of blood falling down on the ground. When he got up from prayer, he came to the disciples and found them sleeping because of grief. And he said to them, "Why are you sleeping? Get up and pray that you may not come into the time of trial." While he was still speaking, suddenly a crowd came, and the one called Judas, one of the 12, was leading them. He approached Jesus to kiss him, but Jesus said to him, "Judas, is it with a kiss that you are betraying the Son of Man?" When those who were around him saw what was coming, they asked, "Lord, should we strike with a sword?" Then one of them struck the slave of the high priest and cut off his right ear. But Jesus said, "No more of this." And he touched his ear and healed him. Then Jesus said to the chief priests, the officers of the temple police, and the elders who had come from him, "Have you come out with swords and clubs as if I were a bandit? When I was with you day after day in the temple, you did not lay hands on me. But this is your hour and the power of darkness." This is the word of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God.
Last summer, I went away, as I do most summers, for a week-long retreat to do worship planning for the coming year. And as I was on that retreat, I had already discerned this vision for the Courage to Heal that has been our focus this year. That God is calling us as a people of God to be a healing people. People who are being healed and people who are a healing presence in the wider community and world. So as I was planning through the course of the year, I was selecting and trying to pave a path for us to journey together along Christ's journey of healing. And when I came to Lent, and specifically to Holy Week, I knew exactly where our attention should lie. In the Gospel of Luke. Back when I went to seminary, I took a semester-long course on the Passion narratives, spending an entire semester immersing ourselves in the story of Jesus' suffering and death, his last 24 hours, in each of the 4 Gospels, and how each Gospel writer tells the story distinctively, uniquely. One of the things I always have carried with me from that class was Luke's telling of Jesus' passion, and how Luke uses Jesus' passion to convey the power of how even in the face of death, Jesus is working to bring healing, to bring salvation that makes things well, that mends what is broken. In fact, some of you may know that St. Luke is frequently called the physician, because Luke seems to have this really singular focus on the healing ministry of Jesus, and seems to understand that at its heart, as we talked about at the very beginning of this series, A Time to Heal, that at its heart, the gospel is a sozo gospel. Sozo, the word salvation, which can not only be translated to save, but also to heal. So today what I'd like to invite us to do is to simply walk together through Jesus' last 24 hours, lifting up particularly those areas where we see Jesus embodying the healing ministry and Jesus challenging us, inviting us to follow him along that same path, that we too might be leaders who are, in the words of the great Henri Nouwen, we are wounded healers as those who lead. I begin with the events that transpired before what we just heard read from what happened in the garden as Jesus was praying. Before that, you'll remember, Jesus gathered with his disciples in the upper room. Luke writes, when the hour had come, he took his place at the table and the apostles with him. He said to them, I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I tell you, I will not eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. Then he took a cup, and after giving thanks, he said, take this and divide it among yourselves. For I tell you that from now on, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine until the kingdom of God comes. Then he took a loaf of bread, and when he had given thanks, he broke it and gave it to them, saying, this is my body, which is given for you. Do this in remembrance of me. And he did the same with the cup after supper, saying, this cup that is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. But see, the one who betrays me is with me, and his hand is on the table. It's a powerful thing to consider that as Jesus was sitting with his dearest friends, the 12, taking the bread and the cup of the Passover meal and giving them this whole new meaning, saying, this is my body, given, broken out of love for you. This is my blood poured out for you. As John describes it, at the same meal, Jesus also went around and washed the feet of each of his disciples. It is an amazing thing to consider that among those disciples was Peter, who within a few hours would deny that he even knew Jesus. That among them is Judas Iscariot, the one who would, within an hour or so, betray Jesus to his death. And yet it was that Jesus offered the gift intimately of his very self, even to Judas, the one who would betray him. It's a reminder to us that if we seek to follow Jesus, we have to expect that sometimes among those who we lead are going to be those who seek to sabotage us, who seek to undermine us, thinking that they're doing what is good and right and holy. Some of us may have found ourselves in the role of Judas in the past in some way. The good news in the midst of that is, even when we are seeking to undercut what God is trying to do, we can trust that Christ bids us a most gracious welcome and gives us the gift of even his very life. After the meal, they of course went out to the Mount of Olives, as Londa read a few moments ago, about Jesus in anguished prayer. Such anguish that his prayer was so earnest, the sweat became like great drops of blood falling down upon the ground. It's a key important lesson here for us, that in important moments of our lives, we need to pray as if our very life depended upon it. Just as Jesus did. Jesus in prayer, of course, his disciples keep falling asleep, and then while he was speaking to them, a crowd came with Judas leading them. Judas comes up to Jesus to kiss him. Jesus saying, is it with a kiss that you betrayed the Son of Man? And in this moment, as the other disciples figure out what's about to happen, they lash out, they draw the sword. One of them strikes the slave of the high priest, lopping off his right ear. Jesus says, "Enough." And he touches the ear of the one who is injured and heals him. Only in Luke do we see this beautiful moment. In the midst of the chaos of Jesus being taken into custody and carted off, and the chaos of his own disciples lashing out, and the chaos of many of them fleeing for their own lives, Jesus, instead of caring about his own life, decides to reach out to the one who's hurt, even in that moment. Even when we are being betrayed to death, leaders who follow Jesus look for the hurt places and reach out in tenderness and in compassion. Jesus is taken away. He's brought before Pilate. Pilate says, "I see no basis for this accusation, but since this man's a Galilean, I'm going to send him to Herod," because this is Herod's territory. And so Pilate seeks to basically pass the buck, so to speak, to Herod. And so Jesus is taken to Herod for Herod to figure out what to do with him. The Jewish leaders want Jesus is dead. When Jesus comes before Herod, Herod too can't seem to figure out anything to do with him. And so he sent Jesus back to Pilate. And Luke notes something. That same day, Herod and Pilate became friends with each other. Before this, they had been enemies. Think about this. These are the very people who have the power to save Jesus from his own death. And Jesus, rather than speaking up or arguing on his own behalf, is working to take his enemies, who are enemies with one another, Herod and Pilate, to reconcile them, to make peace between them, so that they would become friends. How remarkable. I would be arguing and pleading my case. But Jesus has a very different agenda, even as he's walking the path to his own cross. Pilate, of course, then has to figure out what to do. He brings together the chief priests, the scribes, the leaders of the people, and they, of course, incite the crowds who come and demand that rather than Jesus being released, that they should release Barabbas. Barabbas, who was known to have incited a riot, who had been accused of murder. And finally, Pilate relents, and they say, "Well, what do you want?" He says, "What do you want me to do with this Jesus?" They cry out, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" But why? I mean, what has he done? Crucify him! And their voices prevailed, Luke says. You know, anytime in the scriptures when the crowds get what they want, it never ends well. You think about the foot of Mount Sinai, when the crowds, the people demanded that Aaron make for them a graven image. It did not end well. When even the people of God come together thinking that they somehow know what's good and what's right, and they demand some form of mob justice, things do not end well. And yet, as Jesus is led on to his crucifixion, he seeks healing. As they lead him away, they seize a man, Simon of Cyrene, who's coming in from the country. They lay the cross on Jesus and made him carry it behind Jesus. Two others also, who were criminals, were led away to be put to death with Jesus. When they came to the place that is called the Skull, There they crucified Jesus with the criminals, one on his right, one on his left. Then Jesus said, "Father, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." The very ones who pierce his hands, the ones who are just doing their duty, some might say, who bear no responsibility. The truth is, they do bear responsibility for what they've done. And yet, Jesus decides in that moment that the more important thing is to pray for them. Remember, Jesus taught us to pray for our enemies, right? And here he is doing it. Father, forgive them. They just do not understand what it is that they're doing. Hanging there between the criminals, one of them keeps deriding Jesus, saying, "Are you not the Messiah? Save yourself and us." But the other criminal rebuked him and said, "Do you not fear God, since you're also under the same sentence of condemnation? We indeed have been condemned justly, for we are getting what we deserve for our deeds, but this man has done nothing wrong." Then he turned and says to Jesus, "Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom." To which Jesus replies, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Jesus, as he's enduring the most agonizing pain that you can imagine, in that moment, as this one criminal cries out in some plea of mercy, just, "Jesus, remember me." Jesus assures him, "Today you will be with me in paradise." In other words, as Jesus is hanging there, dying for the sins of the world, dying to reconcile us to God, dying to help all the world know and understand that God holds no grudges against us, even in that moment, as one who is dying justly for his sins, Jesus reaches out in love and in compassion, granting reassurance, granting essentially salvation, healing, restoring him, this criminal, to God, and restoring him to the full humanity, his own honor as a human being. It was now about noon, and darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m, while the sun's light failed and the curtain of the temple was torn in two. Then Jesus, crying with a loud voice, said, "Father, into your hands I commend my spirit." Having said this, he breathed his last. When the centurion saw what had taken place, he praised God and said, "Certainly, this man was innocent." The centurion, who bore some responsibility for a perversion of justice, could see that this was all wrong. Jesus was innocent. He had done nothing to deserve this. And yet Jesus never once speaks up for himself, never once seeks to justify himself or to plead or argue his case. Now, friends, I'm not suggesting that in our own lives that we should always subject ourselves to things like a crucifixion unjustly. But what I can say is this: as those who seek to follow Jesus, at some level, we all have to, like Jesus did, surrender ourselves to the things that we have no power over, trusting that God can take and use even the messiest and most desperate and even unjust of circumstances to bring about good. Even those who are deeply wounded can be healers. J.R. Briggs, in his book A Time to Heal, talks about those who lead as wounded healers. And he says this: Christians, leaders, first of all, should always work to build trust. Building trust means investing in relationships and valuing relationships over all other things. Secondly, he says, not only should Christian leaders build trust, but they should also bear pain. Those of us who lead among the people of God, we have to learn what it means to bear pain. We can't always make things better. But that doesn't mean we should run away from the hurt places. We are willing, as Christ did, to bear pain out of love for one another, to bear one another's burdens, as Paul would put it later. Christian leaders, that we build trust, we bear pain, and Christian leaders also give hope. Always knowing and trusting that things look bad right now, and they may seem pretty desperate and helpless and hopeless, but guess what? The God that we serve is the kind of God who takes even the most desperate of circumstances and uses them to plant seeds for something new that we could never dream or fathom in our wildest imaginations. Wounded healers have wisdom and courage and compassion. We follow Jesus, the path of a wounded healer. I'll conclude with a story that a friend of mine shared recently. My friend's name is Steve. He and his wife, both in their 50s, had been married kind of later in life. They had been maybe married 20 years or so. It was a fairy tale kind of romance story, a beautiful story. These two people had fallen deeply in love with one another and gotten married within a few months of meeting each other. And it was just a beautiful story. But then 20 years into their marriage, as they're in their 50s, his wife Mary is diagnosed with a rare and very aggressive form of cancer. They fight it, and they do what they can. And she subjects herself to round after round of chemotherapy. But it gets to a point where it seems like the chemo just is not making enough progress. And even before the doctors asked the question, Mary said, "You know what? I think it's time to quit trying. And it's time for me to just live my life. To stop fighting, to surrender, and to trust that in the midst of this, God is here." My friend Steve said it was one of the hardest things I've ever watched was for her to make that choice. And yet, he said, she did it not as one who was hopeless or helpless, but as one who had a deep and profound hope, who knew she was loved. One day he said, I turned to Mary and I said, "All the agonizing months of chemo, do you think it was even worth it?" To which she said, "Absolutely it was worth it, because without all that chemo, we would not have today." We would not have today. A month or so later, as Mary had grown bedbound, she said something that stuck with Steve, and when Steve shared this story, it stuck with me, and I will carry it with me for a very long time. As she was talking with Steve about her impending death and talking about funeral plans very openly, she said to him, "You know, I think I've come to believe that healing is whatever brings you closer to God. Healing is whatever brings you closer to God." We experience healing in the most wretched and agonizing of places because that is where we come closer to God. And that is frankly where God is oftentimes the closest to us. Those places where we find ourselves, where we just have to throw in the towel and say, "Lord, I can't do anything else." And that's when God comes and says, finally, let's do this thing together. So friends, as we begin this Holy Week, as we hear the story, as we gather at this table, as we break the bread, and as we share the cup, let us do so remembering this deep and profound truth that guides our life as a church, that can guide each of us in our own faith, and that is this: healing is anything that brings us closer to God.